At 2:07 p.m., the Board of Governors of the New York Stock Exchange announced that trading had been closed because of a flood of orders. About half an hour after this, the flash came that President Kennedy was dead. Trading at the time the exchange was closed was running 20 minutes behind floor transactions. The move of the Board of Governors closing the exchange marked the first time there had been a closing in mid-session since the 3rd of August, 1933. The reason then was that gas fumes had leaked out onto the floor of the exchange. Since then, it had remained open through the natural deaths of presidents, Franklin D. Roosevelt, through a world war, through the Korean War, the assassination attempt against President Truman, and the heart attack suffered by President Eisenhower. Through all of these, it had remained open. The exchange publicist said that all market orders for any type that remained unexecuted when trading was stopped had expired. They will not be executed. The last quote came across the tickers 49 minutes after the market closed. Immediately following word that trading had been stopped on the big board, the American Exchange also suspended trading. The Midwest Exchange in Chicago, third largest in the nation, also halted operations, as did the Pacific Stock Exchange. The Cotton and Wool Exchanges stopped trading. So did the cocoa and sugar and other exchanges. The last prices on many of the favorite blue-chip stocks showed them down from $1 to $10. Examples: American Telephone down 7, Chrysler down 4 3/4, United Aircraft down 5 1/4, Allied Chemical down 4 3/8, U.S. Rubber, International Paper each down 3 1/4. The losses were sharp all through the list before the exchange was closed. If it hadn't been for the very fast action of the Board of Governors in suspending the trading, there could have been chaos. And at that moment, you might say, historically, almost all business came to a standstill in the city of New York, the financial capital of the world. And now for more reaction from abroad. We switch about 4,000 miles across the Atlantic, partway across the Mediterranean, for a conversation with Irving R. Levine in Rome.
Hello, Morgan.
Hello, Irving. What time is it over
Morgan,
there?
it's 10 minutes to 11 at night.
What kind of reports do you have for us?
Well, Morgan, here, a crowd of several hundred American tourists are gathered in front of the United States Embassy, drawn there by mutual grief. They are simply standing, reading the English-language Rome American newspaper, a special edition. They're talking among themselves, some crying, watching cars from other embassies arriving with expressions of sympathy. I have a message here, a statement by Francis Cardinal Spellman of New York, with whom I spoke a short while ago. The Cardinal said, "I was terribly shocked and grief-stricken at the dreadful news of the President's death. I have never seen a more universal demonstration of sorrow from people in my lifetime. Bishops from all over the world here in Rome for the Ecumenical Council have been calling me." Cardinal Spellman continued by saying, "It's a loss not only to his wonderful family, but to our country, and a loss to the world. He lived only a short time, but he accomplished tremendous things. He was a brave and courageous man."
That is the reaction there. I notice we have papal reaction here on the death of the president. Do you have any further reports on that?
The recorded excerpt of President Eisenhower's news conference.
I share the sense of shock and dismay that the entire nation must feel at the despicable act that took the life of the nation's president. On the personal side, Mrs. Eisenhower and I share the grief that Mrs. Kennedy must now feel, and we send to her our prayerful thoughts and sympathetic sentiments in this hour.
General, how would you counsel the American people at this time?
In the face of such a terrible thing, I'm sure the entire citizenry of the nation will join as one man in expressing not only their grief, but their indignation at this act, and will stand faithfully behind the government.
General, could you tell us how you got the word?
I was at a meeting for the United Nations, and while there, a member of the meeting was called out and came back and told us the news. Although at that time, we did not know the president was dead. We did not know when I got back here at that time that he was dead. But, matter of fact, we had the last message we had was one rather of hope. And the entire company merely paused for a minute at the request of the chairman, and each of us, in his own way, said a silent prayer for the president.
Should there be any concern, sir, over national security at a time like this?
No, I think the whole nation now would be almost all of us security agents.
General Eisenhower, will the nation be all right in the few months ahead?
Oh, I'm not going to predict anything of that. I just say this. The American nation is a people of great common sense, and they are not going to be stampeded or bewildered.
General, how in history have assassinations affected the political course of events?
Well, of course, in Lincoln's assassination, the presidency went to a man who was a registered Democrat, Mr. Johnson. In Garfield, I doubt that there was any. And, of course, in McKinley, that brought in Theodore Roosevelt. Of course, there have been other attempts in late years. Mr. Truman was at a grave threat to his life, and Mr. Roosevelt, just before he was inaugurated, you remember, down when Mayor Cermak was killed, ran a very grave risk. These things have happened, and it seems inexplicable to me, because Americans are loyal, and it's just this occasional psychopathic sort of accident that occurs, and I don't know what we can do about it.
Could you say anything, General, about how people will feel abroad from all your experience with the United Nations and others? How will it be taken abroad?
Well, I think they will be a bit bewildered. This, in the civilized countries of the world, this doesn't happen so often. And you remember in the starting of World War I, the murder of the Archduke Ferdinand, I think his name was. Well, this itself almost, is one of the contributory causes to that war. And, but here, I just don't know what happens. But we are a nation that where our freedoms are allowed, or are observed in such a way that everybody is ready everybody is, you might say, capable of doing this if he's ready to put his own life on the line.
General, how will you spend the rest of today and tomorrow? How will you spend the rest of today and tomorrow and into the weekend?
Okay. I have canceled the dinner date that I had for tonight. Tomorrow, I'm going immediately to my home, and if I'm wanted for any purpose whatsoever, I will, of course, be available.
Would you have any advice for the American people at this time, General?
No, as I said, I know the American people will stand solid, and they will not be stampeded.
Thank you, Mr. President.
All right.
Thank you.
That was General Eisenhower talking with reporters this afternoon in New York and discussing the assassination of President Kennedy. Here is a chronology of Mr. Kennedy's final hours. At 8:45 a.m. Central Standard Time, the president walked bareheaded and without a coat through a misty rain into a parking lot across the street from Fort Worth's Hotel Texas. He spoke there to a cheering throng of Democrats who could not get tickets to see him at a breakfast appearance, and he apologized because Mrs. Kennedy was not with him. He said that she was organizing herself, and that takes longer. At 9 a.m., the president and Mrs. Kennedy attended the breakfast in the Hotel Texas. The breakfast was sponsored by the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. Mrs. Kennedy walked in some minutes late, and her entrance brought tremendous applause from the 2,500 guests. Both of them were given Texas boots, and the president got a Texas hat. He declined to put it on in public, joking that he would wear it at the White House next Monday. At 10:35 a.m., this is still Central Standard Time, the president and Mrs. Kennedy left the Texas Hotel by auto for Carswell Air Force Base near Fort Worth and their short flight to Dallas, Texas. At 11:37 a.m., the presidential plane, Air Force One, landed at Love Field in Dallas. Mrs. Kennedy came out from the plane smiling and shaking hands with airport greeters. She carried a bouquet of red roses. Several young men in the crowd shouted, "Hey, Jackie," and they moved forward for a closer look. Several young girls were screaming with excitement as they saw the president as he made his way through the crowd. There was no sign of anti-Kennedy sentiment. They left in a motorcade that was to take them over an 11-mile route, including downtown Dallas. At 12:30 p.m., the motorcade approached a triple underpass which feeds into Stemmons Expressway, the 5-lane route to the Dallas Trade Mart where Mr. Kennedy was to make a luncheon speech. A series of rifle shots rang out. The president fell face down on the back seat of his car, a bullet in his head. Governor John Connolly, who was sitting beside him, slumped down on the car seat, wounded in the back. Mrs. Kennedy grasped her husband's head. She gasped, "Oh no." The motorcade raced to Parkland Hospital near the Trade Mart. Mr. Kennedy was taken to the extreme emergency ward where he received a blood transfusion and then extreme unction from Catholic priests. At 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, the president died. And now for a report on Soviet reaction to the president, we're going to hear again from CBS News correspondent Stuart Novins in Moscow.
The word has spread rapidly through this city. It's after midnight, about 1 in the morning, actually. It's snowing. The temperature is below freezing. The streets were fairly empty when the news was first broadcast here in Russian at 10:30 Friday night. First, there was the radio bulletin that the president had been shot. Then, that he was in critical condition. And then Radio Moscow interrupted a sports program. The announcer told his listeners that President Kennedy was dead. The reporters' reaction was shock. One man said, "What's the matter with those right-wing people?" Another said, after being told about the assassination, cold water now. A woman, who very suddenly frightened, said, "Will there be war? Will the new president want war?" At the Soviet Foreign Ministry, the night duty officer told Western reporters, "There is no official announcement yet. Wait for tomorrow." Then, in one conversation, he said, "To you personally, I must say, I am sorry, truly sorry." American students at Moscow University, there are about 20, were first stunned and unbelieving, and then, when doubt could no longer be a refuge, they stood in shock groups. Their friends among Russian students, one American said, came almost shyly to offer their sympathy and condolence. And then the talk became political. What would happen to America now? What would happen to the spirit of Moscow? What would happen in next year's election? One Russian student said, "Kennedy was a bigger man than Eisenhower." Another said, "It's frightful, barbarous." That reaction was echoed by a woman in Red Square. "How can such things happen in a civilized country?" she demanded.
So far, we have nothing, and that is standard.
Thank you, John Chancellor. We now have the sad duty to report that the possibility arises that the death of President Kennedy is connected with the Cold War, and fairly definitely. The police department of Dallas, Texas, reports that Lee H. Oswald, who was arrested in a theater in the outskirts of that city soon after the assassination of President Kennedy, is the prime suspect in the assassination. Curly black-haired man in his 20s as a chairman of a Fair Play for Cuba committee.
A Dallas policeman was shot and killed chasing the suspect. He and another officer had run into a movie theater on a tip the assassin might be inside. The other officer rushed the man and arrested him. A Dallas police captain said the man had visited Russia and was married to a Russian, but this was not confirmed. That's the latest on the President Kennedy death. For more news, we invite you to stay tuned to WJMD. The weather forecast. Don't mail your Christmas cards yet.
Closed down. This is a dark city at night. It's darker tonight than I have ever seen it. This is Stuart Novins in Moscow.
Stuart, this is Dallas Townsend.
Yes, Dallas.
We've all been sitting here listening to that immensely dramatic account of the Soviet reaction. The
Cuba committee idea in the United States.
only in our own country, but in the world. To me, it's a deep personal loss. I was very close to the president. The people of our country will miss this great young man. To his wife and his family, I want to extend my personal condolences. And I hope that everyone in our state will just offer a prayer for the president and for our nation.
A statement from Governor Edmund G. Brown of California from Radio Cape News in Chico, California, as the governor ordered all offices in the state closed.
We're told here in Washington, President Kennedy's body will lie in state at the White House tomorrow. House Speaker John McCormack informed Mutual News that he thinks the body will be taken to the Capitol on Sunday to remain in the rotunda until noon on Monday. Further plans are very indefinite. It's understood the actual funeral services, however, will be held in Boston, Massachusetts. The president's body is expected at Andrews Air Force Base just outside Washington within the hour. For a report, let's go to Mutual's Charles Batchelder at Andrews Air Force Base, Maryland.
Here at Andrews Air Force Base, just outside Washington, the flags were lowered to half-mast on word of the president's death. The body of John Kennedy will return to this base as he has arrived so many times from his flights across the sea for this nation, just about 1 hour from this time. Hundreds of military personnel in the press corps, Mutual's microphones, and others are awaiting the arrival of the president's jet. A military guard of honor will attend. The president's body probably will be taken by an escorted hearse to Washington. Charles Batchelder, Mutual News at Andrews Air Force Base.
Later news from Dallas, Texas, the 24-year-old man who said 2 years ago he wanted to become a Russian citizen, still being questioned to see whether he had indeed any connection today with the assassination of President Kennedy. Police have him in custody. He is Lee H. Oswald, 24 years old, and now he's been identified as chairman of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. It was back in November 1959 that Oswald told the American embassy in Moscow he had applied for Soviet citizenship. He said he'd been a tourist in Russia since October 13th that year. Oswald reported to have a Russian wife. Let's go now to NORAD, North American Air Defense Headquarters, Colorado Springs, Colorado, and a report, Major Dick Cox.
Was received here at the North American Air Defense Command headquarters in Colorado Springs, Colorado, with calm but with great sorrow and concern for the President, his family, and the nation. General John K. Gerhardt, Commander-in-Chief of NORAD, said, quote, "The officers and men of the North American Air Defense Command deeply deplore the grievous loss of their President and Commander-in-Chief. We have been deprived of the outstanding leadership of a great American," unquote. Major Dick Cox, NORAD headquarters in Colorado Springs, Colorado.
That's the word from Colorado Springs in Colorado. Captain or Major Dick Cox now reporting from North American Air Defense Command. We're told that very soon, perhaps within the hour, there'll be an address by the United Nations ambassador, our Governor Adlai Stevenson. Just precisely when that address will be made, we don't know at the moment. But when it is available, we'll relay it to you here. And the stories continue to come in. The acting Secretary of State, George Ball, summoned an emergency meeting of top State Department officials to determine what steps should be taken as the result of President Kennedy's death. Let's get some more reaction from official Washington now. A comment from Postmaster General of the United States, John Gronowski. It's a statement read by spokesman Jerry Waindell at the post office.
This is a statement of Postmaster General John A. Gronowski. The shock and grief that fills me on the death of President John F. Kennedy is overwhelming. The outrageous act of a demented mind that cut down the life of our beloved leader leaves us all bewildered and numbed. Our president is dead. President Kennedy gave his life for his country. He died in the struggle for human rights and human dignity for all people. His death must serve as the gravest possible warning to all Americans that we must work together as a nation to provide once and for all that all men are equal under God. To Mrs. John F. Kennedy and the President's entire family go our prayers and our consummate sorrow. They may find comfort in the knowledge that President Kennedy will be remembered for all time as one of this nation's greatest leaders. To Lyndon Johnson goes our prayers as he takes on the tremendous responsibility of the presidency. We pledge him our complete support as he becomes our nation's leader.
That statement from Postmaster General of the United States, John Gronowski in Washington. We'll continue with more coverage after we pause 10 seconds for station identification. This is the Mutual Broadcasting System.
This is WOL AM and FM. We have a few announcements of the utmost importance. Seton Guild of St. Anne's Catholic Church canceled the fashion show and luncheon for Saturday, November 23rd. Prince George's County Recreation Department has canceled all activities for Friday and Saturday. Tonight there will be a memorial service for the late President Kennedy, place Washington Lee High School, 1300 North Quincy Street in Arlington, Virginia. We'll rejoin the network in just a moment. We have other announcement of sufficient local import to relate at this time. Canceled all evening classes, including law school classes of Georgetown University, are canceled tonight. We rejoined the network.
Him will bear the grief of his death to the day of ours. And all men everywhere who love peace and justice and freedom will bow their heads. At such a moment, we can only turn to prayer. Prayer to comfort our grief, to sustain Mrs. Kennedy and his family, to strengthen President Johnson, and to guide us in time to come.
You're listening to the Honorable Adlai
May God
Stevenson.
help us.
Adlai Stevenson, Ambassador to the United Nations, a statement concerning the tragic death of President Kennedy. At 7 o'clock tonight Eastern Time, we've just been informed the Prime Minister Hume will be going on the air from London with his statement as to the death of President Kennedy, and we will have that broadcast for you direct from our overseas news desk soon as we can get it for you. Also, here's an advisory to all Mutual stations, a note concerning Mutual's operations during this tragic period. No commercial announcements for Mutual are to be used until further notice. We might observe that this is not only the network's decision, but it is also the wish of the advertisers who have contacted the network to request that we do not air any commercials. This advisory is primarily for the information of our Mutual stations. Once again, we'd like to remind you that Prime Minister Sir Douglas Hume will be making a statement from London in about 2 hours from now, which will be broadcast by Mutual quickly thereafter. And at this time, we have just contacted our Rome correspondent, Melton Davis, and he is standing by with this report.
Acting Prime Minister Leone of Italy expressed the feelings of the Italian people tonight when he cabled his dismay at the tragic death of John Kennedy. Consternation reigns here, he cabled Mrs. Kennedy. The friendship of the Italian people for this great friend of our country, this builder of peace, this patriot, this humanist, has received a terrible blow. Other Italians have said to this correspondent, the world's best hope for peace is gone. An Italian cabinet minister, La Malfa, just said here in Rome, after the death of John the 23rd, this is the greatest loss the world could possibly suffer. The head of Italy's Republican Party, Reali, said, John Kennedy's death is a severe blow to Democrats all over the world. We dip our banners in honor of this great man. Social Democratic leader Saragat said that Kennedy felt like a hero in the fight for racial equality. Other parliamentarians spoke of sacrifice, of humanity's loss. But some Americans grouped in front of our embassy, standing shocked, talking in hushed tones, spoke of their anger, their shame, their indignation at this affront to every American.